It's really important to remember that there's nothing natural about images. They don't just come about by accident. They're made by someone, and mostly in our culture, it's been men that have been in charge when it comes to being the authors and creators of popular culture. So if these images are changing, they're reflecting what's going on in the psyches of these men. Actually, what we're seeing, in part, is their pathologies or anxieties being played out on the screen. But this isn't just happening inside the heads of some advertising gurus or Hollywood screenwriters. There's a historical context for all of this.
Knock her down, Marty. Beat her ass. Marty, take her down. Push her down. Marty, just take her down and pin her. You letting a girl beat you?
These changes in images of masculinity are in part a response to a perceived threat to the traditional or dominant idea of masculinity, that is, of white, middle-class heterosexual masculinity. In fact, the various social movements that arose in the 1960s represent an incredible threat to established power. The civil rights movement had started in the 1950s and 60s to challenge the deeply entrenched system of white supremacy. The women's liberation movement had catalyzed serious challenges to male power, winning court battles and making headlines all over the country in the 1960s and 70s. The gay and lesbian movements had been challenging and disrupting heterosexual power and privilege since the early 1970s. And the anti-war and student movements that opposed U.S. intervention in Vietnam had disrupted the plans of political elites, especially as the U.S. suffered what many people regarded as its first ever military defeat. All of these social movements that were taking place around the same time were a really serious challenge to the dominant white heterosexual masculinity that held social, political, economic, and cultural power in the United States. Take the modern multicultural women's movement, for example, which is one of the most important social movements in history. This movement has given us a new way to think about gender relations and sexual relationships and identities, and as a result, many men in society have experimented with new personal styles as well as new attitudes and approaches towards things like relationships, work, parenting, and many other areas. And as a result, there are many young men today who are living lives that are very different from our fathers and grandfathers, and who have incorporated these changes and who are thinking in a much more egalitarian way about relations between men and women, about sexual equality in the workplace, and a whole bunch of other areas of social life. But some men have not reacted well to these changes, and there has been a backlash. In fact, one of the best-selling books of the 1990s was Susan Faludi's Backlash, which argued that a lot of men were very, very disrupted and reacted very poorly to some of these changes. A backlash is an angry and often violent reaction by groups who feel threatened by progressive changes in the culture. Look at the response to Andrew Dice Clay, one of the most popular hate comedians of our time. In fact, Andrew Dice Clay himself is one of the most successful, financially successful live comedic acts, and his career peaked in the early 1990s, and one of the key parts of his comedic act was verbal assaults against women.
Don't marry her, man. How do you know where she's been, huh? Let me tell you, I was out with this dish rag whore a couple weeks ago, right? And let me tell you something. Naturally, you're a fucking dog, all right? So why don't you just, like I said, sit there and shut your fucking hole. Do me a favor. Stupid.
What's most interesting about Dice Clay is not necessarily what he's saying, although that is significant, but rather the audience reaction. The fact is that when this guy was articulating this anger towards women, he would not have found an audience if there wasn't something going on in the culture that he was tapping into. Another popular performer who's tapped into the same kind of anger against women and misogyny that Dice Clay did is Howard Stern. Stern is often portrayed in the popular discourse as this bad boy who's challenging traditional morality and transgressing against authority. But that's such a superficial reading of what he's doing. What Stern actually does is simply reinforce, in crude fashion, some of the most tired, old-fashioned sexist values.
You wearing panties today? Pull your pants off. What about your bra? Is that coming off?
The bra's got to come off.
You got to take that off.
Okay, all right, ladies, are you ready to disrobe? All right. Take off your shirts.
Let me see. Face me. They're not horrible, but I think they should be bigger. You have hair on your ass? Well, you girls go to the gym and work out a little bit.
What Stern does is he creates a world for his largely young male audience, a world in which they can feel good about themselves by putting down and sexually degrading women. The gender world might be changing all around them, but on the Howard Stern show, women are bimbos to be stared at and exploited. That is anything but transgressive. Howard Stern is no anti-authority rebel. His shtick absolutely reinforces traditional sexism.
Say a 6,
9,
8, 10.
And you're like a horse. You're like a fine horse.
A clear indication of how the supposedly lovable Howard embodies contempt for women is in his reaction to the tragic shootings at Columbine High School. When the news first broke about the horrific massacre being perpetrated by Harris and Klebold, the people that Stern identified with were not the boys and girls running for their lives out of the school, but with the male shooters and what he would have done if he was them. On his radio show, he said, and these are his very words, quote, "There were some really good-looking girls running out with their hands over their heads. Did those kids try to have sex with any of the good-looking girls? They didn't even do that. At least if you're going to kill yourself and kill all the kids, why wouldn't you have some sex? If I was going to kill some people, I'd take them out with sex." Unquote. So Howard Stern took the Littleton tragedy as an opportunity to make a rape joke. What a rebel. Another personality who has become popular, in part by playing on men's insecurities in the face of women's increased assertions of equality, is Rush Limbaugh.
Feminism was established so that unattractive, ugly broads could have easy access to the mainstream, right? Did you see it? Yes!
To me, feminism is about equal rights, justice, fairness, and in that sense, it's as American as apple pie. But if you listen to Limbaugh, you'll notice that he's almost obsessed with discrediting strong women. They seem to make him very nervous, even angry.
Bunch of cows.
The reason that Limbaugh uses such derisive and personally insulting terms is that it has the effect of shutting off thinking about the ideas that feminists represent. If you kill the messenger, you don't need to face squarely the implications of the message. And let's not kid ourselves. Feminist ideas are threatening to the conservative, white, heterosexual male power structure that made someone like Rush Limbaugh a star in the first place.